A gas station cashier found a stranger's wallet. Simple enough. But the Mafia boss who lost it went pale the moment he opened it. Something was missing. Something worth far more than the cash inside. And she had seen exactly who took it. The wallet was fat with cash. Grace noticed it the moment she picked it up from the floor near the counter. Thick black leather, no scratches, the kind of wallet that had never once worried about being empty. She flipped it open. A stack of hundreds sat behind a platinum credit card engraved with the name A. Moretti. Below that, a driver's license. The man in the photo had a sharp jaw, dark eyes, and the kind of expression that made you feel you owed him something just by looking at him. Grace set the wallet beside the register and looked out the window. The black SUV that had been parked at Pump 3 was already gone. She sighed. Outside, the Illinois flatland stretched in every direction. Gray sky, dead grass, the faint smell of gasoline that had permanently soaked into Grace's uniform after 3 years of working the same shift at Harlan's Gas & Go. Population, 400. Located approximately nowhere. She was 31 years old, 5'4", 260 pounds, and earning $7 an hour. She had $214 in her checking account, a used Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and exactly 0 reasons to drive a single mile out of her way for a stranger who hadn't even had the decency to notice he dropped something. She Googled the name anyway. Alessandro Moretti, Chicago, real estate, construction. Then she clicked the second result. Her stomach dropped. The headline was from 4 years ago. Moretti Construction linked to Southside labor dispute, 3 hospitalized. Below it, another. Alessandro Moretti questioned in connection with disappeared contractor. Below that, a photo. The same sharp jaw from the driver's license, but this time he was stepping out of a courthouse in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 men whose necks were wider than their heads. Grace closed the browser. She looked at the wallet. She looked at the clock. Her shift ended in 40 minutes. Then she did something that even she couldn't fully explain. She slipped the wallet into her jacket pocket, finished her shift, and drove north on Route 47 toward Chicago, with the address from the driver's license typed into her phone and the heating vent pointed directly at her face because the car's heater only half worked and it was 30 degrees outside. It took her an hour and 40 minutes. The address led her to a building in River North that had no name on the outside, just glass, steel, and a doorman who looked at Grace like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. "I have something that belongs to a Mr. Moretti," she said. The doorman stared at her uniform, still carrying the ghost of a coffee stain from the morning rush. "Do you have an appointment?" "I have his wallet. I don't think he's going to ask for an appointment." 7 minutes later, she was in an elevator she was too nervous to fully appreciate, and then she was in a room that felt like it cost more than her entire hometown, and Alessandro Moretti was standing across a marble table, looking at her the way people look at a thing that doesn't make sense. He was taller in person. "You drove from Harlan County?" he said. "Harlan Township," she corrected. "It's not a county. Most people don't know it exists." He almost smiled. Almost. He took the wallet from her hand, checked the cash. All there, she noticed him checking, and she didn't bother to be offended. And then he opened the small interior zip pocket behind the credit cards. His face changed. It wasn't a slow change. It was the kind of change that happens when the ground moves. Sudden, total, wrong. The color left his face like someone had pulled a plug. His jaw tightened. His hand was completely still, which was somehow more alarming than if it had been shaking. "The drive," he said quietly. Not to her, to himself. "I'm sorry?" There was a flash drive in this pocket. Small, black, no label. His voice was controlled, but his eyes were doing something else entirely. "Was it on the counter when you found the wallet?" Grace thought back. The wallet on the floor. The customer at Pump 3 who'd paid in cash and left in a hurry. The man who came in right after. mid-30s, baseball cap, fidgeting, who'd lingered near the counter for a moment before buying a bottle of water and leaving. "There was another customer," she said slowly. "He was standing right where the wallet was. I thought he was just waiting his turn." She paused. "He bent down near the floor. I figured he dropped something." Alessandro set the wallet on the table. "He picked something up," he said. The room went very quiet. "What was on the drive?" Grace asked. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her to leave. Instead, he said, "7 years ago, a woman I was going to marry disappeared. The drive contained the last footage ever recorded of her." He turned around. "I have spent 7 years trying to find out what happened to Isabella." Grace felt something shift in the room. Not danger, exactly. Something older than that. Grief that had been living in the walls for so long it had started to look like furniture. Then his phone rang. He answered it, listened. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A tightening, like a man bracing for impact. "When?" he said. Then, "How many injured?" Then nothing. He hung up. "What happened?" Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she was supposed to. "A building collapsed," he said. "Old warehouse, one of my former project sites." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The third one this year." He said it like it meant something, like it was supposed to mean something to her. And standing in that cold, expensive room, still wearing her gas station uniform, still smelling faintly of motor oil and burnt coffee, Grace realized that it did. She just didn't know why yet. "I can help you find him," she said. "The man who took the drive. I remember his face." Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. "You drove 100 miles to return a wallet," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She thought about it honestly. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I had nothing better going on." This time he did smile. It was a small thing, barely there, but it changed his face completely, like a light turning on in a house you thought was abandoned. "All right, Grace," he said, reading her name from the employee ID still clipped to her jacket. "Let's go find him." Alessandro's people were efficient in the way that money makes things efficient. By midnight, they had pulled security footage from 3 different cameras along Route 47, cross-referenced payment records from the gas station system, and identified the man in the baseball cap as Dale Pruitt, a freelance delivery driver from Gary, Indiana, with a suspended license and a history of picking up odd cash jobs that didn't ask for a name. Grace sat in the corner of Alessandro's office the entire time, drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup, and watching 3 men in expensive suits work laptops like they were defusing bombs. Nobody told her to leave. Nobody acknowledged that she was there either. She was starting to understand that this was simply how Alessandro's world operated. People either had a function or they didn't, and the ones who didn't tended to disappear from the room without anyone noticing. She stayed in her chair and said nothing. By morning they had an address, a truck plaza off Interstate 90 in Indiana, where Dale Pruitt was scheduled to pick up a freight load before noon. Alessandro drove himself. That surprised her. She'd expected a driver, another wide-necked man in the back seat, some kind of procession. Instead, it was just a black car, Alessandro behind the wheel, Grace in the passenger seat with a gas station sandwich she'd bought from the lobby vending machine because no one had offered her breakfast and she wasn't going to ask. "You don't have to come," he said, pulling onto the highway. "You need me to identify him," she said. "You've only seen a blurry camera still. I saw his face." He didn't argue. That was another thing she was learning about him. He didn't waste words fighting points he'd already lost. They found Dale Pruitt sitting in a booth at the Truck Plaza diner, working through a plate of eggs like a man with nothing on his conscience. He was thinner than Grace remembered, the baseball cap replaced by a trucker hat, but the nervous energy was identical, fingers tapping the table, eyes moving to the door every 30 seconds. She confirmed it with a single nod. Alessandro slid into the booth across from Dale before the man could process what was happening. Grace sat beside Alessandro, which she realized created the very specific impression that she was involved in something significantly more dangerous than she actually was. Dale looked at her, then at Alessandro, then back at her, as if hoping she might be the safer option to appeal to. She gave him nothing. "I didn't steal anything," Dale said immediately, which was a remarkable thing to say to someone who hadn't accused him of anything yet. "The flash drive," Alessandro said. "Where is it?" Dale's fork stopped moving. "I found it on the floor. I thought it was mine. I lose those things all the time. I've got like 6 of them in my glove box. I wasn't trying to—" "Where is it now?" Not a question. A place where a question used to be. Dale's shoulders dropped. "I don't have it anymore." He looked genuinely uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing too late that a small decision has led somewhere very large. "A guy approached me, maybe 4 hours after I left the gas station. I stopped here for fuel and he was just waiting, like he knew my route." Alessandro's expression didn't change. "What did he look like?" "Normal. That was the thing. Just completely normal. 30s, brown jacket, forgettable face." Dale hesitated. "He offered me $800 for it. Said it was his and he dropped it at the gas station. I figured, it seemed reasonable, right? I didn't know what was on it." "Did you look at what was on it?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "No," Dale said. Grace watched Alessandro decide not to push that. Instead, he said, "How did he pay you?" "Cash, small bills." "Did he give a name, drive anything you remember, say where he was going?" Dale shook his head, then stopped. "Wait." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled delivery manifest. "He asked me about my route. I had this on the seat. He looked at it, just for a second, and I remember thinking it was weird because his eyes went straight to one specific line." He smoothed the paper on the table and pointed. "This pickup location, right here." Grace leaned forward. There was a company logo printed in the top corner of the manifest, a small geometric mark, 2 triangles overlapping inside a circle. She'd seen it before, not at the gas station, somewhere else, something recent. She pressed her memory, and then it landed cleanly. "The partial footage," she said, turning to Alessandro. "The backup from the security drive. There was a truck in the background of the lot. That logo was on the side door." Alessandro looked at her. "You remember that from one viewing," he said. "I remember most things I see," she said simply. It wasn't a boast. It was just true. It had always been true, and it had never once been useful, until right now. Alessandro took the manifest, folded it carefully, and placed it in his inside pocket. "Then we're not looking for a man anymore," he said quietly. "We're looking for a company." Outside, a truck rumbled past on the interstate, and somewhere in the distance, something that felt very much like the real beginning of this story finally shifted into gear. The logo belonged to a company called Trimark Logistics. On paper, Trimark was a perfectly ordinary freight and warehousing company based out of Milwaukee, registered in 2004, clean tax records, a modest website with stock photos of smiling warehouse workers. The kind of company that existed in the background of the economy, invisible, unremarkable, the sort of name you'd see on the side of a truck and forget before you'd finished reading it. Alessandro found the connection in under an hour. Trimark had been a subcontractor on 4 of his construction projects between 2014 and 2017. Supply delivery, materials transport, nothing significant. Their contract had ended quietly when one of his project managers switched vendors. No dispute, no paperwork, no reason to remember them. Except that one of those 4 projects was a building in Milwaukee that had failed a structural inspection 3 times before it was eventually approved and completed. And 1 year after completion, a section of its parking structure had collapsed. Nobody died that time, but someone could have. Grace wrote the dates in a small notebook she'd bought from the Truck Plaza gift shop. She was building a timeline without being asked to, and Alessandro noticed but said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a compliment. They drove to Milwaukee that same afternoon. The construction archive was tucked inside an industrial park on the west side of the city, a squat brick building that stored physical records for projects dating back to the 1980s. Alessandro had used this archive during the original builds. He still had access. A tired clerk led them through 2 locked doors and into a back room that smelled like old paper and dying fluorescent light, then left them alone with 4 filing cabinets and a shelf of boxed backup drives. They found the relevant drive on the second shelf. The footage was partial, corrupted at the edges, several gaps where the recording had skipped, but enough of it survived to matter. Alessandro connected it to his laptop. The playback was grainy, time-stamped in the corner. November 3rd, 2017, 11:42 p.m. The camera was positioned high, looking down at a records room very much like the one they were currently sitting in. For the first 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then a door opened and a woman entered. She moved quickly and quietly, the way people move when they know they shouldn't be somewhere. Dark hair pulled back, sharp features, a long coat. She went directly to the 3rd filing cabinet, 2nd drawer, like she'd memorized the location in advance. She pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table. Then she took out her phone. She began photographing pages. Not randomly, she was selective, deliberate, flipping through the folder and stopping at specific documents. Inspection reports, Grace realized, watching the shapes of the pages. Stamped pages with diagrams and columns of numbers. Alessandro had gone completely still beside her. The woman on the screen reached the end of the folder, replaced it exactly as she'd found it, and turned to leave. For just a moment, she faced the camera directly. Alessandro stopped the footage. The woman on the frozen screen looked back at them. She was beautiful, in the way that photographs of serious people are beautiful, not arranged for it, just incidentally. Her expression was focused and frightened in equal measure, the expression of someone doing something they believed in but weren't sure they'd survive. "Isabella," Alessandro said. It was barely a word, more like something escaping. Grace let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke. "She knew exactly where to look," she said carefully. "She came prepared. This wasn't curiosity. She was building something. A record." Alessandro restarted the footage. They watched it twice more, and the second time, Grace stopped paying attention to Isabella and started paying attention to the documents instead. The camera wasn't close enough to read the text, but the format was clear enough. She'd seen enough similar paperwork in her life. Her father had worked construction for 20 years. These were materials inspection reports, approved certifications for structural components, the kind of forms that existed to confirm that what went into a building was what was supposed to go into a building. She opened her notebook. "Alessandro," she kept her voice even. "What projects are these records from?" He checked the archive label on the drive, read her the list. 4 projects, all completed between 2015 and 2018. Grace wrote them down and then turned the notebook so he could see what she'd already written, the list of buildings connected to structural failures. The timeline she'd been quietly assembling since the truck plaza. 3 of the 4 projects on the drive appeared on her list. She watched him understand it. "Every project Isabella investigated," she said, "later had an accident." Alessandro stood up and walked to the far side of the room. He stood facing the wall for a moment with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders carrying something that hadn't been there this morning. "She wasn't documenting accidents," he said finally. "No," Grace agreed. "She was documenting the cause." The fluorescent light above them flickered once and held. Somewhere in those inspection reports, she knew, was the name of whoever had signed off on materials that were never what they claimed to be. Somewhere in those reports was the reason Isabella had run. They just didn't have the reports yet. The town didn't have a welcome sign anymore. Someone had taken it down years ago. Or maybe it had simply fallen and nobody had bothered to put it back. That felt about right for Delwood, Ohio, a small river town that had been quietly falling apart since the factory closures of the 90s and had never quite found a reason to stop. Grace noticed the empty lot first. It sat in the middle of the town like a missing tooth, a rectangular patch of cleared ground surrounded by a chain-link fence with a faded sign that read, Delwood Community School, Future Site of Rebuild. The sign looked at least 3 years old. Nothing behind it suggested any rebuilding was coming. That's where it happened, Alessandro said. He was reading from a file his team had sent overnight. 6 years ago, the gymnasium roof of Delwood Community School had collapsed during an evening basketball practice. 11 people injured, 2 finished. The official report cited aging infrastructure and inadequate maintenance. The building had been reinforced 18 months before it fell. Moretti Construction had held the reinforcement contract. Alessandro hadn't spoken for most of the 2-hour drive from Milwaukee. Grace had let him be quiet. She understood by now that his silences weren't emptiness. They were weather. Something was always moving through them. They parked near the empty lot and got out. An older man was standing at the chain-link fence, hands wrapped around the links, staring at the ground inside. He didn't look at them when they approached. He already knew why strangers came to this particular fence. His name was Gerald Marsh, Sophie's father. He'd lived 4 blocks away his entire life and had not once, he told them, stopped coming to this fence since the day they cleared the rubble. People from the city came, he said. Lawyers, investigators, insurance people, they all said the same thing. Old building, not enough upkeep, nobody's fault. He finally looked at Alessandro. You're Moretti. It wasn't a question. Alessandro held the man's gaze. Yes. Gerald looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Grace, as if trying to understand what she was. Because she clearly wasn't a lawyer and clearly wasn't security. She was just a woman in a sensible jacket with a notebook and an honest face. There was a woman, Gerald said, came here about 6.5 years ago, before the collapse. He paused. She was asking questions about the reinforcement project, wanted to see the contracts, the materials deliveries. She came back 3 times over about 4 months. He released the fence. We thought she was a journalist. Her name was Isabella, Grace said quietly. Gerald nodded slowly. She never told us that. She called herself Marie. He almost smiled, a sad, compressed thing. But she left us her real number by accident once. The name on the account said, I. Russo. He looked at the empty lot again. After the collapse, I tried calling. Number was disconnected. Grace wrote the timeline in her notebook. Isabella had been in Delwood before the gymnasium fell. She'd been trying to prevent it. She hadn't managed to, and Grace could only imagine what that had done to her, carrying the weight of a collapsed roof and 2 names she couldn't save. They spent the rest of the day talking to families. Gerald introduced them quietly, without ceremony, and the town opened up the way small towns do when they've been holding something painful for too long, and someone finally shows up who seems willing to actually listen. An older woman named Patricia showed them photographs of the gymnasium taken during the reinforcement project. Her son had worked on the crew. A retired engineer named Howard spread original blueprints across his kitchen table and pointed to load-bearing joints that should have been reinforced with steel, but looked, in the photographs Patricia provided, suspiciously thin. I said it at the time, Howard said. I told the site manager those beams didn't look right. He told me I didn't know what I was talking about. He tapped the photograph. I know what I'm talking about. Grace watched Alessandro across the table. He was listening with the focused expression she'd come to recognize. Jaw set, eyes sharp. But underneath it, something was fracturing. She could see it the way you can see a crack in ice before it spreads. He had believed the accidents were unavoidable. She could tell that from the way he'd initially spoken about them, a kind of resigned acceptance, the posture of a man who'd made peace with bad luck. He was realizing now that it wasn't bad luck. Someone had made decisions, specific, deliberate decisions, and people had died for them. Walking back to the car as the sun dropped behind the tree line, Alessandro stopped beside the empty lot again. He stood looking at the cleared ground, the old sign, the fence that Gerald Marsh visited every single day. "I built things," he said quietly. "My whole life. I thought that meant something." Grace stood beside him. "It still can," she said. "That's why we're here." He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in his office, assessing, measuring. Something quieter than that. Then he looked back at the empty lot and said nothing more. But he didn't walk away either. The pastor's name was Edmund Cole, and he was 73 years old, recently retired, and the kind of man who made you feel immediately that he had never once said a dishonest thing in his life. He met them at the door of a small white church outside Lexington, Kentucky, with a handshake for Alessandro and a longer look at Grace. Not suspicious, just reading. The way old people read strangers when they've seen enough of them to know the difference between the ones who want something and the ones who are carrying something. He decided something about Grace in about 4 seconds and led them both inside without another word. The church basement smelled like candle wax and old wood. Folding chairs were stacked against one wall. A long table held a coffee maker, 3 mismatched mugs, and a plate of store-bought cookies that Pastor Cole had clearly set out in advance, which meant he'd been expecting them, which meant someone had called ahead. Grace looked at Alessandro. He said nothing, which confirmed it. "She stayed here," Pastor Cole said, settling into a chair and wrapping both hands around his coffee mug. 3 weeks. This was, let me think, nearly 6.5 years ago now. She said she was doing research, historical preservation, she told me, which was not entirely a lie, I suppose, depending on how you look at it. He paused. She was frightened. She hid it well, but I've sat with enough frightened people to know what it looks like when someone is always listening for the door. "She never told you her real name?" Grace asked. "Not for the first 2 weeks. Then, one evening, she came downstairs and sat right where you're sitting and told me everything." He looked at Grace steadily. Not because she trusted easily, because she needed one person in the world to know the truth in case something happened to her. He stood, moved to a shelf behind the table, and returned with something wrapped in a plain cloth, a journal, dark green cover, the pages swollen slightly from years of being handled and stored. He placed it on the table in front of Alessandro. Alessandro didn't move for a moment. Then he picked it up and opened it. Grace watched his eyes move across the first page, then stop. He turned the journal so she could read it. Isabella's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who thought carefully before committing anything to paper. The first entry was dated nearly 7 years ago, 2 weeks before she disappeared. Grace read it slowly. "Victor has been replacing the approved materials on at least 6 projects. I have the delivery manifests, the substitution orders, the sign-offs. The steel that went into Delwood was graded 2 levels below specification. The concrete mix used in 3 Chicago projects was cut with aggregate that no legitimate inspector would pass. He has been doing this for years, and the savings go somewhere that isn't on any balance sheet I've been allowed to see." Grace set down her coffee. Alessandro trusts him completely. That is the problem. Victor Salerno has been his partner since the beginning. They built the company together, and Alessandro believes that means something permanent. He won't hear a word against him. I tried once, carefully, without showing my evidence, and the conversation ended badly. I understood then that I couldn't go to Alessandro first. I needed everything. Airtight, undeniable, the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away or buried by Victor's lawyers.
3 days from now, I am meeting a contact who can help me get the financial records. After that, I will have enough." The entry ended there. Grace turned the page. There were no more entries. The silence in the basement was total. Pastor Cole sat quietly with his coffee, giving them the room they needed. Alessandro had gone very still in the way Grace now recognized. Not emptiness, but pressure building somewhere underneath. "Victor Salerno," he said. The name came out flat and strange, like a word in a language he'd just been told he'd been mispronouncing his entire life. "His closest partner," Grace said carefully, "since we were 26 years old." Alessandro closed the journal, set it on the table. "He was at our engagement dinner. He gave a speech." He stopped. He cried during the speech. Grace said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. She was going to expose him, Alessandro continued. And 3 days later, she was gone. He looked at Pastor Cole. "Did she ever come back? Any contact after she disappeared?" "A letter," the pastor said. "About 8 months later. No return address. It said only that she was safe and that she was sorry for worrying me." He folded his hands. "I kept it, naturally." He produced it from the same shelf, a single folded page, the handwriting identical. Grace read the relevant line. "I cannot come forward yet. He has connections I am still mapping. If I move too soon, people who trusted me will be hurt. I have to finish what I started." Grace sat back. She was looking at the journal, the letter, the timeline in her notebook, and she was thinking about a woman who had watched a gymnasium collapse from a distance, carrying evidence she couldn't yet use and had kept going anyway. "Alessandro," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Isabella wasn't taken," she said. "She ran. On purpose." She let that land. "And she's still out there, still building the case." The candle on the table between them burned without flickering. Alessandro looked at the journal for a long time. Then he said, "We need to find her before Victor realizes we're looking." The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that didn't ask questions. That was the only way Grace could describe it. A narrow brick walk-up in a quiet Nashville neighborhood where the mailboxes had numbers instead of names, and the landlord, a heavy-set man named Russ, accepted cash and kept his eyes pointed at the floor as a matter of professional habit. Isabella had rented it under the name Claire Whitfield. Alessandro's team had traced the alias through a chain of utility payments, a forwarding address from a Kentucky P.O. box, and a phone number that had been active until 8 months ago. The apartment itself had been vacant for 6 months, but Russ had kept the unit as is because the last month's rent had been paid in advance, and the tenant had left a note asking him not to disturb the contents. He unlocked the door and left without being asked. Inside was a life lived in careful pieces. A single bed, neatly made, a small kitchen with nothing perishable left behind. Bookshelves along one wall, filled with what looked like an ordinary collection. Paperbacks, a few reference books, until Grace looked closer and noticed that several of the spines were false, hollowed-out covers concealing folded documents and sealed envelopes. A corkboard above the desk had been stripped bare, but the pinholes remained, scattered across the surface in a pattern that told its own story. A large central cluster connected to smaller groupings, a map of something that had been carefully assembled and then deliberately removed before she left. She had known they might come. She had cleared the obvious things and left the hidden ones. "She's been living like this for 7 years, Grace said, pulling a sealed envelope from behind a copy of a field guide to North American birds. She held it up. Alessandro took it and opened it. Inside were letters, 6 of them, all handwritten, addressed to no one. Grace read them over his shoulder, not because she was asked to, but because he didn't stop her, and she had learned by now that Alessandro's permissions were mostly communicated through silence. The letters were not confessions, they were explanations,
Written, Grace suspected, for the version of Alessandro that Isabella had hoped would eventually find this place. Each one covered a different phase of the years she'd been gone. The first was dated 7 months after her disappearance. "I know what my leaving did to you. I have thought about it every single day. But I had stood at the edge of what was coming, and I understood that if I stayed, Victor would know what I'd found, and the witnesses I'd already spoken to would be in danger. He is not a man who leaves loose ends. You know that better than anyone, even if you have never let yourself think about it directly." Grace set the letter down. The next one, dated 2 years later, was harder to read. "I almost came back twice. The second time, I got as far as booking a flight. I sat at the gate for an hour, and then I thought about Gerald Marsh standing at that fence, and I understood that I didn't have the right to stop yet. Not until it was enough. Not until it was truly enough to put him away permanently." Alessandro folded that letter precisely in half and placed it in his jacket pocket without a word. The remaining letters mapped her movements: North Carolina, coastal communities, connecting with families of collapse victims, building her network quietly over years. Each letter revealed another layer of what she'd constructed alone, and with each one, Grace felt the shape of it growing larger and more deliberate than she'd imagined. This wasn't a woman in hiding. This was a woman at work. "She's not running anymore," Grace said, standing at the stripped corkboard, tracing the ghost pattern of the pinholes with one finger. "These marks, the clustering here and here, this is coordination. Multiple sources feeding into a central point. She's been gathering, and she's close to finished." She turned around. "She took the board because she's using it somewhere else. She's still active." Alessandro was looking at the bookshelf, at the false spines, at the small evidence of a life constructed entirely around a single purpose. "She gave up everything," he said. "Yes. The wedding, the house, her name." He paused. "Me." Grace heard something in that word that she chose not to examine too carefully. Not yet. She chose what she could live with, Grace said, not what was easy. Alessandro turned away from the shelf. When he looked at Grace, his expression was different from anything she'd seen from him before. Not the controlled blankness he used in professional situations, not the fracturing grief she'd seen at the fence in Delwood. This was something raw. A man being forced to completely rebuild the story of the last 7 years of his life. "The letters mention North Carolina," he said finally. "Coastal communities, survivor families." "That's where the network is," Grace agreed. "That's where she'll be." Alessandro pulled out his phone, then stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd noticed him doing more frequently since Kentucky. Like he was recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. "You know," he said, "when you walked into my office 4 days ago, I thought you were just someone returning a wallet." Grace picked up her notebook. "I was," she said. "Things change." The North Carolina coast in late November looked nothing like its postcards. The tourist towns were shuttered for the season, the beach roads empty, the water a hard gray-green that matched the sky almost exactly. Grace found it beautiful in a way she hadn't expected. Stripped of its summer performance, the coastline looked honest. Just land meeting water, doing what it had always done, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. They drove south along the coastal highway, stopping at 4 different communities over 2 days. The first family lived in a yellow house set back from the road in a town called Merritt's Point. Their name was Carver, a mother, Diane, and her 2 adult sons. Their father, Dennis Carver, had died in a warehouse collapse in 2018. Moretti Construction had built the warehouse. The official cause was listed as foundation failure due to soil conditions. Diane Carver met them at the door with the expression of a woman who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything and had decided that calm was the only weapon left to her. She knew why they were there before they explained. "Marie called us," she said, 2 days ago. She said someone was coming. Grace and Alessandro exchanged a look. Isabella had known they were following the trail. She had been one step ahead of them the entire time, which meant she'd been watching, or someone in her network had been, and she'd chosen not to disappear again. She had instead told her people to open the door. That meant she was ready. Diane led them to her kitchen table, where a cardboard box sat waiting. Inside were documents Grace could see immediately were significant: engineering assessments, delivery receipts, photographs of construction sites, a bound set of witness testimonies typed and signed with notarized stamps.
Dennis kept records, Diane said. He knew something was wrong with the materials being used on site. He told his foreman. The foreman told him to keep his head down. She looked at Alessandro without blinking. 3 months later, the building came down. Alessandro sat across from her and did not look away. "I'm sorry," he said. It was 2 words. Grace had heard people say those 2 words 100 ways: defensive, performative, rushed. Alessandro said them like they cost him something real. Diane studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once and pushed the box toward him. The second family was a retired school teacher named Norma, who lived alone in a blue cottage near the water and had lost her younger brother in the Delwood Gymnasium collapse. She had spent 4 years filing complaints with state oversight boards, all of which had been quietly redirected, reviewed by nobody, and closed without action. She had a filing cabinet full of the paperwork to prove it. "Marie helped me understand what I was looking at," Norma said, running one hand across the cabinet drawer fondly, like it was something she'd raised. "Before her, I just had a pile of paper and nowhere to send it. She helped me organize it, identify which documents mattered, connect it to the other families." She paused. "She's extraordinary, that woman. What she's done, alone." The third stop was a construction worker named Paul, who had been on the crew for one of Moretti's Chicago projects and had quietly photographed materials deliveries for 8 months after noticing discrepancies between what the manifests listed and what actually arrived on site. He'd sent his photographs to 3 journalists. None had published anything. He handed over a hard drive without being asked. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to actually show up," he said. The fourth stop was a small community center, where 6 people were already gathered around a folding table when Grace and Alessandro arrived. Men and women of various ages, connected by the specific grief of people who had lost someone to something preventable and been told repeatedly that prevention had not been possible. They had testimony, documents, photographs, engineering analyses paid for out of their own pockets, financial records that had been leaked by a former Salerno company accountant who had since moved abroad. Isabella had spent 7 years quietly stitching these people together. Grace sat at that table for 3 hours, listening and taking notes. And somewhere in the second hour, she stopped thinking about the case and started thinking about the people. The way Diane Carver passed coffee around the table like it was the most natural thing. The way Paul kept his hard drive in a lockbox he clearly took everywhere. The way Norma had memorized every document in her filing cabinet by heart. Because she'd read them so many times, she'd stopped needing to look. These were not victims waiting to be saved. They were people who had saved themselves the only way available to them, by refusing to let go. She felt Alessandro watching her from across the table. When she looked up, he shifted his gaze immediately, but not quickly enough. Walking back to the car after the last meeting, the water visible at the end of the road, Alessandro said, "You're good with them." "They're easy to be good with," Grace said. "They just want someone to take them seriously." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "I should have taken them seriously years ago," he said. "Yes," Grace said. "You should have." She didn't soften it. He didn't ask her to. They drove toward Charleston in the dark, carrying a back seat full of evidence and the particular silence of 2 people who were thinking about the same thing, but weren't ready yet to say it out loud. Isabella Russo was sitting on a park bench overlooking Charleston Harbor when they found her. She wasn't hiding, she was simply there. Dark coat, coffee in hand,
watching the water the way people watch things they've looked at so many times they've stopped seeing them and started using them to think. She looked older than her photographs, not worse, just more real, the way people look when they've been living instead of just existing. She saw Alessandro first. She stood slowly, and for a moment neither of them moved. Two people on opposite ends of 7 years of silence, standing 20 feet apart with a harbor wind moving between them. Grace stopped walking. This was not her moment, and she knew it. Alessandro crossed the distance. They didn't embrace immediately. They stood close, looking at each other with the careful attention of people checking whether the person they remembered still existed inside the person in front of them. Then Isabella said something Grace couldn't hear, and Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, and they held each other the way people hold each other when they're not sure they'll get the chance again. Grace looked at the water. She gave them 4 minutes. Then Isabella pulled back, wiped her face with the back of her hand in a brisk, unsentimental way, and looked directly at Grace.
"You're the one who found the wallet," she said. "You know about that?" "I've been watching Alessandro for 3 weeks. I knew something had shifted when he left Chicago without his security detail and drove himself to Indiana." A faint smile. "You were an unexpected variable." "People keep saying that," Grace said. They sat together on the bench, the 3 of them, and Isabella laid out what she had with the focused precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in their head for years. The case against Victor Salerno was extensive. 7 years of patient, methodical collection had produced something that no single lawyer could dismantle and no single payment could make disappear. Materials fraud across 11 projects, falsified inspection reports bearing forged engineer signatures, a parallel set of financial records showing the cost savings being funneled through 3 shell companies back to Victor personally. 31 witness testimonies, notarized and stored in 4 separate locations. She had been 2 weeks away from delivering it to a federal prosecutor she had spent a year vetting. 2 weeks, Alessandro said. 2 weeks, Isabella confirmed. And then your wallet fell out of your pocket in rural Illinois and everything accelerated. She said it without blame, but the implication was clear. Victor's people had been watching Alessandro too, and the sudden change in his movements had triggered something. The man who'd taken the flash drive hadn't been opportunistic, he'd been positioned. Someone had been monitoring Alessandro specifically, waiting for any sign that he was getting close to the truth. Victor already knew. As if confirming the thought, Alessandro's phone buzzed. He read the message, and his jaw tightened. 3 of the archive locations my team flagged this week have reported break-ins, he said. Last night. Isabella was already standing. He's moving to destroy records. We expected this. Contingency files are stored separately. He won't find them. But we need to move the witnesses. She looked at Grace. You said you remember details. The original gas station footage. Think carefully. Victor's financial records. Isabella's coded notes mentioned a storage location. There was a company name, a partial address. Grace thought back. The footage they'd recovered in Milwaukee, the partial drive, the background of the lot. There had been a truck, the Trimark logo, and behind it, barely visible, a street sign and partial building number. She hadn't mentioned it because it hadn't seemed relevant at the time. She closed her eyes. The image assembled itself the way it always did. Clean, still, like a photograph in a drawer. The street sign said Halstead, she said slowly. The building number was partial. I could only see the first 2 digits, 47. And there was a secondary logo on the loading bay door, smaller than the Trimark mark, a diamond shape with a letter inside. She opened her eyes. The letter was V. Isabella stared at her. V for Valcor, she said quietly. That's one of Victor's shell companies. She grabbed her phone. Halstead and 47. That's a warehouse district on the south side of Chicago. He's been storing the original falsified documents there, the ones that would prove the forgeries were centrally coordinated, not isolated incidents. She was already dialing. If we get those documents before he destroys them, the case is complete. What followed was not dramatic in the way Grace had expected. There were phone calls, a federal contact Isabella had kept warm for months, a carefully coordinated arrival at a South Chicago warehouse that involved people Grace was not introduced to and did not ask about. Alessandro and Grace waited in a car on Halstead Street while it happened. When it was done, Isabella emerged carrying a single black case and nodded once. Victor Salerno was arrested at his home 3 days later. He opened the door in a bathrobe, Grace heard afterward, which struck her as exactly right. The ending of something that had run on fear and careful presentation for years, concluding with a man in a bathrobe. No warning, no dignity, no escape. Isabella stood outside the federal building afterward and breathed the cold air for a long time. Then she found Grace beside her. "Thank you," she said simply. Grace nodded. "You did most of it." "You remembered the sign," Isabella said. 7 years of work, and it came down to a street sign in a piece of corrupted footage that you saw once." She shook her head. "That's not nothing." Grace looked across the street to where Alessandro was standing, watching them both. "No," she said quietly, "it isn't." 1 month later, Delwood looked different. Not physically, not yet. The empty lot was still empty, the chain-link fence still standing, the faded sign still promising a rebuild that hadn't started. But something in the air had changed, the way air changes in a room when a window is finally opened after years of being sealed shut. People stood straighter. Conversations happened on front porches that hadn't happened in years. Gerald Marsh still visited the fence every morning, but now he wasn't alone. 3 or 4 others came with him, and sometimes they brought coffee, and sometimes they just stood together without saying anything, which was its own kind of progress. Victor Salerno had been indicted on 43 counts. The charges covered materials fraud, falsification of safety inspections, criminal negligence resulting in death, and financial crimes spanning nearly a decade. His lawyers were expensive and loud, but Isabella's case was airtight in the specific way that 7 years of patient, meticulous preparation makes things airtight. The shell companies had been unraveled, the forged signatures matched to a single source, the financial trail mapped so completely that there was nowhere left to stand. 3 of his former associates had already agreed to cooperate. The families had been notified personally, not by a press release or a legal form letter, but by phone calls and visits from Isabella herself, who spent 2 weeks traveling to each household and sitting with them long enough to answer every question they had. Grace heard about this secondhand from Diane Carver, who called her one afternoon out of nowhere. "She stayed 4 hours, Diane said. "We had dinner. She cried once, just briefly, and then she stopped and kept talking." A pause. "I didn't expect that. I expected professional. I got human." "That's who she is," Grace said. "I know that now," Diane said. "I thought I'd hate her. I wanted to, a little, because it's easier. But I couldn't." Another pause. "How are you, Grace?" It was such a simple question that Grace didn't know what to do with it for a moment. "I'm all right," she said, and meant it. She had gone back to Harlan Township after Charleston, back to the gas and go, the $7 hourly rate, the flatlands and the gray sky and the smell of gasoline that lived permanently in the fibers of her jacket. Her manager had given her a look when she returned after 6 days' unannounced absence, and she'd told him she'd had a family emergency, which was not entirely a lie, because something had happened that felt seismically personal, even though none of the people involved were technically her family. She worked 3 shifts. On the 4th day, Alessandro called. He didn't open with small talk, which she appreciated. He said there was a ceremony in Delwood, a groundbreaking for the new school, properly funded now through a combination of the recovered Salerno assets and a construction commitment Alessandro had made personally, using people he'd vetted himself, materials he was overseeing directly. He said he thought she should be there. "Why?" she asked. A pause. "Because it started with you." She drove to Delwood. The ceremony was small and unceremonial in the best way. No podium, no speeches written by committee, no local politicians angling for photographs. Gerald Marsh said a few words, standing beside the fence, facing the lot where his daughter had died, and his voice broke once and recovered, and nobody looked away or pretended not to notice, because the people gathered there had all earned the right to stand inside difficult moments without flinching. Then a small girl, the daughter of one of the injured players from that night 6 years ago, 7 years old now, too young to understand fully, but old enough to understand something, walked to the fence and tied a yellow ribbon to the chain link. Grace stood at the back of the gathered crowd and did not trust herself to speak. Alessandro appeared beside her without announcement, the way he'd started doing, materializing quietly, no entrance, as if he'd been there slightly longer than she'd noticed.
"The contractor breaks ground Monday," he said. 16 weeks to completion. I'll be here every week." "That's not very efficient for a man who runs a company," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They stood watching the crowd for a while. "Isabella is going to be all right," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Alessandro said. "She is." He said it with a steadiness that told her he'd made peace with what that meant, that Isabella's story and his story had run parallel for 7 years and had now arrived at the same point and gone in different directions, cleanly, without bitterness, the way two rivers separate when the landscape finally tells them to. He turned to look at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "After this?" Grace thought about Harlan Township, the gas and go, the cracked rear bumper, the half-working heater, the $214 that had probably been spent by now on the utility bill. "Go back to work," she said. "I have a job for you," he said, "if you want it." She looked at him sideways. "Doing what?" "Remembering things," he said, "noticing things, asking questions that people with expensive educations are too proud to ask." He held her gaze. "I'm rebuilding how I operate, from the foundation up. I need someone who understands what foundations are actually for." Grace looked at the yellow ribbon on the fence, moving gently in the November wind. She thought about a wallet on a gas station floor, about a drive she'd made for no good reason except that it was right, about 8 days across 6 states, and a woman who'd spent 7 years alone, finishing something that mattered more than her own comfort. She thought about the look on Gerald Marsh's face when ground would finally break on Monday. "I'll need a better salary," she said. Alessandro almost smiled. "Done. And I'm not relocating." "Fine. And I still think you check the cash when someone returns a wallet, which is a character flaw you should work on." This time he did smile, the full version, not the barely there one from that first night in his office. It changed his face the same way, like a light in an abandoned house, but this time the house didn't feel abandoned anymore. "Noted," he said. The yellow ribbon on the fence caught the wind again and lifted, bright against the grey November sky, and the crowd around the empty lot stayed a little longer than they needed to, nobody quite ready to leave a place that was finally, after years of being defined by what it had lost, beginning to be defined by what it was going to become. Grace stayed too. So did Alessandro. Some broken things, she thought, can be rebuilt stronger than before. She was beginning to believe that included people.